Welcome back to our Eternity series where we wrestle between the finite world and the infinite world. We've been given gifts of light and music. We've heard stories of growth. And then in our last video, we rethought how we did math. We thought of math as an action. And so multiplication was like a rotation. And we split multiplication up into two parts. We talked about the distance and then we talked about the direction. And then the negative sign, multiplying by a -1, represented a 1/2 of a turn. So if we have a half of a turn, why can't we have a half of a turn? It kind of makes sense in 2D space because that gives us a north, a south, gives us an east and a west directions. And so we imagine a new number, a thing, and we define that thing as I. So what exactly is I? Well, I is a number we just created out of the thin air. We called it an imaginary number, and we just defined it such that I squared equals -1. It really is that simple. And in this video, we're going to take a look at that because we're going to see how the number I is not just a number, it's not just a thing, it becomes a place. So now today, what we have to imagine is we have to imagine a place for our thing, for our number I to do, well, for I to do its thing. Well, I'm glad you returned because last time we talked about an imaginary number. I know that was like kind of far out there for many of you. So let's take a step back and return first of all to our real number line here where we got 0, +1, and -1. And so if we start at 1 and we multiply by -1,
we get over it.
We get a -1.
Yep.
And if we multiply by -1 again,
then we're back here.
Yeah, so in other words, -1 times -1 is -1 squared. So what we can say is -1 to the first power gets us there. Yep. -1 squared gets us here. Then -1 cubed will get us right back here. -1 to the fourth. And that pattern just continues. And we can actually start at 0 because -1 to the 0 by definition is actually 1. And so the pattern starts here where we can say -1 to the 0 is 1.
Yep.
-1 to the first power is -1. -1 to the second power gets us there. So we've got this nice little pattern of 1/2 rotation. And that's getting us ready now to zoom back into our imaginary guy. And before we do that, let's bring back our little twister friend that might make it a little easier. And so if we start here as our beginning point with that blue, remember when we multiply by I, that's like a 1/4 rotation. So we go from 1 to land on I, and then we do multiply by I again. So I squared, that lands on -1.
Yep.
And we didn't talk about this, but then now if we have I cubed or multiply by it times 3 times, we land on here, and it looks like that was a positive I. So what we have here would be a negative I. It just kind of follows that same pattern. And then when we multiply by I again, we literally go full circle and we land back at 1. So let's kind of build that with our little building blocks that we've got and see how we can do that. Okay, so we're gonna prop 0 up so we can see it. And so here we're gonna do the same thing but talk about I. So I raised to the 0 power lands on 1. I raised to the 1 power is I raised to the 2 power is -1. I to the 3rd power is negative I. Yep. And I to the 4th power. So what we have is this thing right here becomes a new axis, a new dimension that is built by these imaginary numbers where if we go 1 unit up, we land on I, and we go 1 unit down, we would land at -I. And then of course, if we would just continue that pattern and go up another unit, we go from 1I to
2I.
2I. And a -I, we go down 1 more, we land on -2I. So this functions just like our real numbers, except we have that I that's kind of attached to it that we multiply by. And this is called the complex plane. But so far, all we've got is these number lines. We haven't gone completely off-road, which is I know where you want to end. And so we can talk about different points. And so let's put something over here. Yeah, that red one works. Okay, and so let's think about what is this point. This is just a point, like all these other points. And how far did we go in this direction?
Just 1.
1, and that's a real number 1.
Yep.
And then from here we went up 1.
I.
So what would you think that point coordinate should be?
1i.
1i. So if we would write it in the way we do our xy coordinates, it would just be 1 comma I. And that's actually correct. That's how we would do it on the complex plane. But we could also do something a little bit different that really adds a lot of value. We actually, instead of using a comma and making it a point, we actually make it a number. And we just call it 1 plus I. And so it's no longer just a point, but it's a number. It's 1 plus I. And that's going to open up all kinds of doors to really go off-road in math. And it's a beautiful thing that mathematicians came up with, and everything plays out just wonderful. And so let's just do another point just to see how that works. So we'll kind of do the same thing over here. So let's figure out, Jack, you help me figure out, well, what should this point be right here?
Well, it's negative over here.
Negative
so
1, that's the real
1,
number.
And then I.
And then positive I, because we're going up. So the coordinate would be negative 1 comma I. But if we wanted to write that as a number, we would say that would be negative 1 plus 1i, or 1 times I is just I. So it would be negative 1 plus I. And so we have two different points now that are off-road in this complex plane. And that pattern seems pretty easy to be able to manipulate and add things with. And it really is that easy. And in fact, we can take like these 2 points that are coordinates, but they're also numbers. We can add those 2 numbers together. And so it may seem weird to adding points together, but we know how to add numbers. So let's just kind of follow our math and just use our intuition to see where that gets us. So what was this number again?
1i.
Yep. Okay, so we got 1 plus I, and this guy was?
Minus 1 plus
minus
I.
1 plus I. So when we add those 2 together, I guess our intuitive thing would be we would just add the real numbers together. So we have a positive 1 and we have a negative 1, and that equals 0. So our real number is 0. So on this axis, we're right there. And then in our imaginary axis, we had plus 1 and plus 1, so and that would equal 2i. And 2i. Yep. So we would go up here because this would be 1 unit up, and then we would go 2 units up. And so we just added 2 complex numbers basically by just using intuition of 1 plus I and minus 1 plus I, and that equals 0 plus 2i.
Cool.
And yeah, so now we are going off-road in math, and that's going to allow us to do all kinds of amazing things. I find the complex plane fascinating. In a strange way, I think of the complex plane as some sort of Narnia from a C.S. Lewis novel. On one hand, it is completely made up with imaginary numbers rotating around. However, on the other hand, it is very real and makes perfect sense even though it is not a physical thing. Life is also about places, but usually it is places that we see. However, all this makes me wonder, are there places in life that are real, but are not visible? Again, Brian is going to challenge our thinking about possible places that we cannot see.